Down Under by Bill Bryson, book review. So this book is actually published under two different titles. It was published as Down Under in the UK and published as In a Sunburned Country in America. I'm an American myself, but the version of this I read was one that was given to me by a UK couple that I knew in Japan, and so that's the version I read. I briefly flipped through the American version. I think my sister had a copy with the American version, and it does look like there are some differences. I think they're mostly in terms of like chapter organization or chapter headings. I didn't do a detailed comparison. I assume there's no major differences in the content, but just to be safe, I'm going to label this review as Down Under, although it's also published as In a Sunburned Country in America. So this is Bill Bryson's travel book about Australia. This is one of my scripted reviews, meaning I take a review I wrote on the weblog 10 years ago and try and make it into a YouTube video. In this case, I read this book about exactly 10 years ago now, when I was going to study at the University of Melbourne in Melbourne, Australia. And I read this book on the plane ride over to Australia and also finished it up during the first week or so that I was living in Australia. So I was reading this book while I was in the process of moving to Australia. Bill Bryson, you've probably already heard of him because he's a famous writer, and then because he's a popular writer, you probably already read a couple of his books. But if you haven't, he is worth checking out. He does a lot of stuff, but I think he became famous as a travel writer. And he's a sort of humorous travel writer. Now, I don't have a lot of experience with the genre of travel writing, but I guess the image I had of it before I started reading Bill Bryson was about, rugged people who go backpacking up in the mountains or something like that. And that's not at all Bill Bryson's style. He's very much an average guy, and he goes to normal hotels and he eats at normal restaurants. He talks about the food he gets on the train or the cup of coffee he has. It's a very down-to-earth quality. It's very breezy and easy to read, and a lot of humor mixed in with it. And I've previously reviewed on this channel some of his other travel books, The Lost Continent, A Walk in the Woods, and then a couple other of his books which are not about travel, but The Mother Tongue and the Life and Times of the Thunderbolt Kid. So I don't want to repeat myself too much from those previous reviews in which I praised his humor and I praised his style. It's all there again in this book. A lot of good humor and a very easy to read style. Again, as I mentioned before, I was reading this book as I was spending my first week in Melbourne. And so I don't know if this is of interest to anyone else but me, but it was interesting to see a lot of the things that were in Bill Bryson's book in person after I had read about them. And on one hand, this shouldn't be surprising because he's writing about the city, but I don't know, it felt kind of cool to me. It was like, oh, hey, I just read about that in the book. So, for example, Crown Casino, biggest casino in the southern hemisphere in Melbourne. I checked it out after reading Bill Bryson's description of it. I found it was much like he described it. The statue commemorating the tragic expedition of Burke and Wills is in Melbourne. I saw that statue and I knew what it was about because Bill Bryson had gone into the history of that in this book. He goes into some of the history of Australia as he recounts some of the famous parts. Likewise with Ned Kelly. Now Ned Kelly is somebody I would go on to hear a lot about in the year I spent in Melbourne because he's a very important figure in Australia. He's kind of like their Billy the Kid. That's oversimplifying a bit, but maybe you get the idea. He's an outlaw legend who was hanged in Melbourne Again, the first week I was there in Melbourne, an Australian friend pointed out to me the jail where Ned Kelly was hanged. And I said, all right, I know about Ned Kelly. He was in Bill Bryson's book. Now, Bill Bryson was my first exposure to Ned Kelly. I would go on to hear a lot more about him during that year, but it was useful for a first exposure. The Immigration Museum in Melbourne, I made a point of checking it out, precisely because Bill Bryson had mentioned it in his book. The Parliament building in Melbourne, I took the tour of that, and I knew that that had once been the national capital of Australia because Bill Bryson had mentioned it in his book. The infamous Melbourne right turns, which is a special way of turning right in Melbourne, that irritates a lot of people who both live there and who are temporary residents or tourists. I heard people complaining about it, and I thought, I know what those are because Bill Bryson described them in his book. You get the point. There's a lot of interesting little bits of trivia about Australia that were in this book and that I subsequently picked up on in real-life conversations. Which is the value of a book like this. You don't think you're learning a lot because it seems like such a bright and easy read. Sorry, light and easy read. Light and breezy read or whatever. But you do pick up a lot of interesting little bits and pieces from this book, which in my case proved to be useful during my first few weeks in Australia. Another thing I thought was interesting, The book was originally written in 2000. I went to Australia in 2010, so the book was about 10 years old by that time. And in the book, Bill Bryson describes how when you open up an Australian newspaper, he said there were these two politicians who were arguing with each other, and it was all over the Australian newspaper at the time. And their names were Abbott and Costello. Now, Abbott and Costello, if you're not familiar with classic film, Abbott and Costello were a famous vaudeville pair who did a lot of bits, did comedy sketches back in the 1930s and 40s. You've probably heard of them. They're quite famous. So there were these two feuding Australian politicians, one named Costello, one named Abbott, who were arguing with each other, and it was in the papers kept talking about Abbott and Costello arguing with each other. What was interesting to me is I came to Australia 10 years later, picked up the paper during the first week I was there, and still 10 years later, in the Australian papers, it was talking about Abbott and Costello arguing with each other. So I guess that went on for 10 solid years, or I don't know. But I just thought, that's still going on. I read about that in Bill Bryson's book. That Abbott, by the way, went on to become Prime Minister of Australia in 2013, I believe. Tony Abbott. That was after I left Australia. I was just there for the year of 2010. But, yeah, there you go. Interesting, huh? One final note. Bill Bryson talks about the attitudes of some of the Australians he meets, particularly the ones on the Indian Pacific Railroad, and the unfortunate attitudes they have about the Aboriginal people. Now, talking about the attitudes of a country is a little bit of a lost cause, because a country is made up of a lot of different individuals, and they all have each individual has their own opinion. It's especially perhaps dangerous when you're doing something as sensitive as racial relations or racial prejudices. But yeah, there are some racial issues in Australia. That wasn't noticeable to me quite the first week I was there, but definitely by the end of the year there, I had witnessed enough things or acquired enough stories some of them firsthand and some of them secondhand, that indicated there was a problem with racial attitudes in Australia. And the impression I got by the end of that year was that it was more acceptable in Australia to be openly racist than it was in America, or at least the part of America where I was from, or my little pocket of it, or my experiences. Although I don't know though, because I think maybe in America, the past few years, it seems like we've gone back on this a little bit, where it does seem like some of the racists are becoming a bit more open now than they were 10 years ago. I don't know. On the other hand, though, it should be noted that at the university I went to, they were very progressive, and they were almost hypersensitive to the plight of the Aboriginals, to the point where they would begin any student assembly by acknowledging the Aboriginal peoples whose land the university was built on. And I thought, oh, that's very progressive. I did not remember, in my experience growing up in the Midwest in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I certainly do not remember any assembly starting out by acknowledging the native peoples on whose land this place was built. I was reading just the other day that Frederick DeBoer's blog, actually, if you know him, he was saying, I think he was complaining about how common this is in leftist discourse. So, maybe again, this is just my provincial, small town, Midwest thing that I wasn't aware of it. Maybe this does happen more at bigger, more liberal universities in America. University of Melbourne, that was my first experience with it. And I was impressed by it. I thought that's a good thing to do, is to start off by acknowledging that this was originally somebody else's land. For whatever that's worth. Anyways, sorry, that's a bit of a digression. The main point being, I guess, I would recommend this book. It was easy to read, it was funny, and I learned a lot from it.